let me just. I can start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Turkey has always been riding the fence. They used to be a strategic partner to the NATO because they were seen as a buffer zone. But most recently, notably, we see that they have increased dispute with members in NATO. They have Islamic military rise and increased volatility of their political leadership with Erdogan. They deal specifically nuclear weapons and arms with Russia. This has all led to the tipping point, and this is why we vote that we should expel them from NATO. What does expelling from NATO look like? 2 things. They lose their financial support. So this is billions of dollars that currently NATO is putting into Turkey for the purpose of having a buffer zone. And second, we will not, or NATO will not no longer intervene in the conflicts they cause by disputing with members or with non-member states in NATO, and basically for aims that NATO does not support, but intrinsically just follow the individual value, the individual aims of Turkey. Why do we suggest this? We claim that recently, because of all of this, Turkey is not a unique partner. That's for when we implement this, it will allow space for NATO to move to more reliable partners. Why is Turkey not a unique partner anymore? We give you 3 reasons. First, financial assets. We say that currently in NATO, currently in Turkey, there is increased political risk with military, with Erdogan's vulnerability, with Islamic military rise. We say that this political risk impacts the finances of Turkey. It is also the fact that Turkey is one of the worst impacted economies by COVID, and they're not even taking care of their people. So they're acting undemocratically, and this is impacting the financial assets. And we see that they can no longer contribute to the common goals of NATO. Second, we see in terms of their military capacity. So preeming that they're a strong military actor, we see that actually with all of this financial economic implications, it is actually most of the funds and their arms come from the US and from the rest of the European members. So they actually bring up way stronger support. So losing Turkey in this instance is not going to have a significant impact on the military capacity of NATO. Third, we tell you geopolitical location. Why is this no longer unique? A, if they were being used as a buffer state in the south of Europe, we're saying that we have states such as Greece and Bulgaria, which have been parts of NATO for a longer time, which we have present troops and their strategic plans, and we really have cooperation with. But B, we also say that there is strategic international acting of NATO with their expansion. For example, this year's admission of Macedonia within the forces of NATO. Judge, this is a very clear sign that NATO is moving away from Turkey, and they're signaling this with completing their buffer in the southern state beyond Turkey. Beyond Turkey. 4, we have seen it's no longer a unique partner because we have seen intelligence reports that Turkey is selling weapons to ISIS. And Erdogan is increasing this volatility. So we're seeing that this is no longer something that we should support as NATO, as a state, because it's going against the support of the NATO values. And 5, we're saying that even Turkey was a buffer state. We're saying that we see how this actively changes because we use Turkey as a buffer state, for example, to secure the borders and prevent a migrant crisis. But let's see what's happening with Belarus now, right? Russia is flying over Turkey. So Turkey does not act as a buffer anymore. So we see that actually the strategic value of Turkey has diminished close to nothing. And we also see 2 direct impacts from this. First, we say that we won't, even if we expel Turkey or vote to expel Turkey from NATO, we won't lose them. We won't lose them because they will only make them come back to the negotiation table. Why is this? And we believe that they'll become more cooperative. This is because we believe that they desperately need the funds from NATO and they need the security from NATO, especially when they're in a very vulnerable financial situation as I posed. So this is only going to push them to the negotiation table where we won't lose them. But even if we give it the best case, and we say that even if, for example, we lose them and they further relationship with Russia, we say that this is not a unique harm. 1, because they're already doing so. They're doing this on both sides of the debate. But second, we see that it is not way off, but all of the damaging, basically the damaging harms and the damaging behaviors that we will get on their side of the debate. So we're saying that even if there are very, very small geopolitical reasons to still expel, even though we explained in our model how they're diminishing day by day, this is why it's very important for us to expel Turkey. And this is because they're violating NATO duties and they're not a reliable partner. And I give you 5 unique reasons of why they're not a reliable partner. First, we tell you that they're not a reliable partner because they have repeatedly engaged in not democratic behavior. They have repeatedly engaged in very questionable military behavior. For example, selling arms to ISIS or selling arms to like very not democratic regimes that NATO as a core organization stands against. Second, we tell you that having Turkey in actually deteriorates day by day the organizational cohesion. This is because they're actively antagonizing important members of NATO, such as Greece. They're doing this in 4 different ways. First, if you look at, they've actually had a major conflict in Cyprus in 1974. But even outside of that, they have annexed part of Cyprus, and they're doing this in a behavior the way that Russia would be doing to Crimea. So how are we supposed to protect Crimea if we're allowing one of our members to do annexation, such as the ones they have committed in Cyprus? Second, we're saying that they actually also, with Greece, still have airspace. They're completely violating their airspace with a lot of flying out over their skies. And third, we also say that they still have conflicts in the disputed Eastern Mediterranean waters for gas exploration activities with Greece, and they're continuing to do that and there's no mechanisms to stop them because we allow them as NATO to do so. Third, we're saying that why they're no longer a reliable partner is because they have violated the NATO duties by cooperating closely with Russia, while at the same time they're very volatile because in 2015 they shut down aircrafts of Russia and risk a very aggressive response from Russia. So we're saying they're also like this very dangerous and aggressive states that NATO stands against for. They're very playing both sides of the fence, and we're saying that this increases the risk of aggressive response, which NATO does not want and stands for a more peaceful world. Fourth, we say that in Turkey we also see a democratic overreach. Why is this? For example, look at how Erdogan rose in power, how much it violates human rights, repeatedly what is happening with the Kurds within the state, the failed 2016 coup. And I do not need to give you a history lesson of Turkey because we all know that is one of the worst regimes that we currently see in modern times. 5, we're also saying that the fact that they're actively working with Russia is intrinsically bad, right? Because like Russia is the biggest opponent of anti-NATO agenda, right? For example, like as I said, like if you look at Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, only when Ukraine started to be closer to NATO, closer to European Union, it shows you how Russia has aggressive response to this. And we're saying that Russia, it can only penetrate the agenda and the strategic planning of NATO only through Turkey, because the Turkey is the only Asia-European state which falls within the NATO membership. All of the rest are very Western-based European members or the US members. So Turkey is actually the most valuable one, but it's also the geographically closest one to Russia. So that is why we repeatedly see their shifting in behavior towards partners from that geographic sphere. But what are the impacts from this? We give you 4 different impacts of why it is so important that we do not have unreliable partners. First, we say that there's a principal obligation, right? Like, how does NATO work? NATO works by countries contributing their funds, countries contributing in their military, opening up their borders, opening up their space for NATO troops. And we're saying that the whole purpose of all of these countries is that they want their resources to be used properly and for this common aim. And using most of those resources towards Turkey is violating the principle of the member resources. Second, we say it creates moral hazard because Turkey is getting more and more validated because they have more leverage, because we're never punishing for their actions. Third, we say that they antagonize other there's increased risk because they antagonize other countries within NATO, and they're really risking the cohesion of the organization. And 4, we say that it's damaging NATO's credibility, right? Because countries can start withdrawing from NATO just because NATO is not punishing Turkey for any of their behavior. And this is especially in times where we need NATO the most. For example, when there is basically a lockdown happening in Belarus, the immigration crisis, NATO is needed and resources are needed in the appropriate places. For all this, I beg you to vote affirmative. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that fine speech, and would now like to invite the first negative speaker to open the case for Saeed and Nick. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear whenever you're ready.
Okay, just give me a second to set up my camera. I mean, I'm assuming I can be seen because I can see myself. So it'd be a bit unfortunate if I'm the only person that can see myself. Great. Starting my speech in, oh, where's my timer? Here we go. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. First, why this alienates Turkey from NATO, and comparatively why we will win them back. Secondly, why warm relations with Russia is better than encouraging aggression. And thirdly, why expelling Turkey is a short-sighted strategic blunder that gives Russia the upper hand. Before that, first, the counterfactual. We think that NATO should allow for Turkey's continued membership. That comes with a couple of things. 1, implementing both incentives to side with NATO, purchasing NATO weaponry, joint military operations, and intelligence sharing agreements, and the continued ability to use Turkey as a station for NATO military presence in the Caucasus, probably, or in the Black Sea. What does being NATO give you? So it gives you the ability to have credible mutual defense agreements that heavily disincentivize aggressive foreign overreach over your sovereignty, and check and balancing on bad leaders and military support. So like controlling your flow of military aid and getting access to arms deals. Rebuttal. They have two types of claims on affirmative side, both of which are really good for us. The first type of claim they have is a bunch of reasons for why we don't need Turkey. We give Turkey a lot of money. Turkey's not unique, and there's lots of risk from Erdogan's volatility. I want to note that these are all reasons for why we can indeed control Turkey without expelling them. And while I'll add some later in my speech, I just want to illustrate that these are all already sufficient reasons to prove that we have the capacity to tell Turkey what to do, and Turkey will follow, for the reason that if we don't need them, in terms of leverage, we have more leverage than they do, which is why they would follow what we would say. So it's clear to me that we don't need to expel Turkey in order to get them to do what we want. We can still use them for all the things that we want without being forced to have like all this fear and so on. So that's just the first point, which is that framing response, their material doesn't actually prove the conclusion that they wanted to prove. The second group of claims they have is that it would be bad to have Turkey in NATO, which are somewhat more direct, but are just worse claims. So the first claim they have under this is that Turkey is selling arms to ISIS. They just assert this, by the way, they have no proof. We counter assert that it is untrue, and that should be sufficient to neutralize it. But secondly, there's proof against it. That is to say, Turkey doesn't sell arms to ISIS because this is extraordinarily risky. Their funds and therefore their missile systems could get used against them because ISIS is the conflict in Syria is proximate to the conflict in Turkey, the Turkish border. Beyond that, Turkey is one of the strongest proponents of stability in Syria because they take on the burdens of refugees and migrants nearby. So Turkey does not indeed definitively not sell arms to ISIS because there would be no incentive for them to do so. That's the first reason they have for why it would be bad to have Turkey in NATO. The second reason they have is that Turkey has a bunch of other terrible stuff they're doing. They're annexing Cyprus and have democratic overreach. The broad response to this is that they don't fix it because they make things worse by expelling Turkey. The first is that the loss of this money, presuming that they do give money as financial aid, makes them more desperate for Cypriot oil, makes them more desperate for populism because of the fact that this economic weakness breeds desperation in people. Beyond that, it even further pushes them into the arms of Russia for the very basic reason that if they need to get arms from someone, they will get it from someone for sure, but it won't be from NATO anymore. On our side, NATO leverage allows them to do things like park troops on Cyprus to prevent war crimes and to ensure that this populism doesn't occur by presenting reasonable checks and balances, and to ensure that Erdogan isn't shooting people in the street. So these are all reasons for why, presuming Turkey is bad, these are not reasons to push Turkey away, but in fact reasons to bring them further into the fold. Having said that, this transitions me neatly into the first argument. This alienates Turkey from NATO and is comparatively likely that we will win them back. First, I want to prove that this action forces Turkey to double down on Russia. Note, there are three reasons why. The first is that Erdogan lives and dies based on nationalistic rhetoric. So this vote to expel Turkey is a push for him to perceive NATO as overtly hostile, and as such, he has a political incentive to cater to pander to the populace and be very, very against NATO and side further to Russia. Secondly, they need military assistance. Now they can only get it from Russia, which is why they're more likely to get more deals from Russia and be more dependent on them. And thirdly is that you also are likely to have economic delinkage from the West as a result of the loss of aid that Affirmative mentions. Their rebuttal is that Turkey's already going to Russia, therefore it's fine. The point is that there's a massive world of difference between the degree to which they are with Russia now and the degree to which they would be pushed to Russia. That is to say, the willingness they have to support things like the Armenian genocide, or the willingness that they have, for example, to be a launching pad for potential conflicts in the Caucasus. These are all things that they are firmly sided with NATO upon, and things that they may be willing to change their mind on depending on how close they are to Russia. So there's a wide range of impacts, whether it be things like checking authoritarianism in that area, whether it be how the human rights regime that they have that would substantially worsen over time. Maybe Turkey isn't perfect, but it's certainly a far cry from shooting people in the street and outright overt authoritarianism and dictatorship. Secondly, though, without overt pressure from NATO as a threat of expulsion, there are many strong incentives for Turkey to return to the West's sphere of influence. First, look at all the rebuttals I gave earlier that point out that much of AF's reasons are reasons for why Turkey would return on its own. Here are some additional reasons for why Turkey would return, as opposed to doubling down on our side on neg. First, Turkey is currently in a massive inflationary currency crisis, and the lira has seen the greatest drop in decades. Everyday market prices are too much for the average citizen. And so, in addition to that, Turkey has interest in EU accession in order to access the European single market. What many citizens have done is that they've sold their currency to buy US dollars, and so the US has very large power over Turkey and can essentially drop the price of the lira even more. to combat inflation, Turkey is starting to take on more debt, and much of the lenders are from Western nations. So they control the biggest banks, they control the largest financial institutions. So these are like 4 or 3 separate financial reasons why Turkey, on its own, without overt pressure, would return to NATO. This is important because this is the biggest threat to Erdogan's power. He's losing the trust of the populace and losing the trust of oligarchs, and as such, Erdogan is likely to pivot to the West, and what we are doing by taking Turkey out of NATO is forcing him to double down on his relations with Russia right now. Why is it important to win Turkey back than it is to stop some Russian arms deals? One, Russia is a strong military power, but it's unlikely to threaten expansion right now since it's still impoverished, struggling with a pandemic. Putin's grasp is weakening, and he has Parkinson's, he's sick, and as evidenced by the growing opposition movements led by Navalny, meaning he has to focus his resources on domestic crises. So regardless of Russia, there are many more other pressing threats that Turkey is currently vital to, like their role in the Belarusian immigration crisis. The Turkey is helping us stem the flights of refugees that Belarus is using to manipulate the EU at its border. It doesn't matter if we have another buffer state in like Macedonia, right? Because the flights are coming from Turkey. You can't use more land to block the planes coming in. Beyond that, the NATO foothold in Central Asia and the Middle East, which will become particularly important when we've lost Afghanistan, and increasing Chinese presence via the BRI in the region. So it's key to be able to keep some troops stationed to quickly respond to the outbreak of any violence or exploitation. So on the impacts, one, we can still win Turkey back, which has all the benefits, taking whatever half has but doing it better. But additionally, a Turkey that becomes belligerent and hates the West can be really, really bad, losing the ability to check and balance whatever goes on in Russian aggression in the Caucasus. We don't have the military launching pad and resource to be able to provide military support to allies. Second argument, warm relations with Russia is better than encouraging aggression. So the first thing I want to highlight is that even if Erdogan continues to become friendly with Russia and does a lot of terrible things, we can't expel Turkey on this basis alone because his regime is unlikely to remain in power for long. First of all, the 2023 elections, where he's currently extremely unpopular, his party lost a mayoral election in Istanbul in around 2019, and the majority of the working class population that once voted for him see him as plunging the country into poverty because they no longer have a strong economy. So it will be difficult for Turkey to rejoin NATO once you've kicked Erdogan out, rather. So what happens then is that the political will turns against NATO, and it's expensive to reestablish its presence because they have to do things like bring in all the millions of dollars to rebuild the military infrastructure that you took out. So for these reasons, first of all, it's likely that Turkey will return to NATO after Erdogan leaves. So we don't think actually that they will continue staying with Russia. But even if they did, that's not even a bad thing. If Turkey moves towards Russia, having on either side of the house, then the only thing we can realistically change is Russia's attitude towards NATO, and having an expressed threat of trying to isolate Russia has always been responded to with force and belligerence to discourage countries from even considering NATO's sphere of influence. For example, when NATO aggressively negotiated for Georgia's accession to NATO, Russia invaded Georgia and took Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The response from Russia in attempts to isolate, not only in the specific instance of trying to bully Turkey to isolate Russia, but also just the overt, credible threat of trying to isolate other countries, means that Russia will be more likely to invade and be more belligerent overall, creating more conflict in the area. This is by and large a terrible thing because it means massive conflict, massive deaths on either side of the house, but far worse than affirmative. For these reasons, you must negate. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that fine speech. Would now like to invite the second affirmative speaker to continue and extend the case. Side affirmative. Here.
Hi, you able to hear me okay?
All good whenever you're ready.
My favorite part of this debate so far was watching a world finalist scramble after the speech that my partner gave to try and squirrel this entire debate by saying, no, we can do the exact same thing on our side of the house. If Turkey is vulnerable, we should do things like threaten them with NATO membership. We should do things like threaten them with our funding and with the military alignment that we have. Nope, panel, which is exactly what we are defending on our side of the house for two reasons. One, that's literally how we've modeled it, in which the debate is expecting us to talk about, so they can't have the exact same on their side of the house. But two, and most notably, structurally, they're intertwined because the ways in which the the agreement works and how NATO operates is that the types of funding that they want to withdraw from NATO, that they want to withdraw with Turkey, the type of military support and cooperation that they want to withdraw from Turkey are predicated on membership. And so you cannot withdraw one whilst maintaining the membership, or if so, it would be a highly unjustified version. Then they have to defend the principled ways in which we obligate this and the practical harms of seeing NATO become an increasingly volatile organization that does not follow its own doctrine, that could withdraw support from you at any time, regardless of your level of membership, which one, disincentivizes new states from coming in, which is exactly how NATO is trying to shore up its borders unresponded to by partner. Two, causes current states to want to invest less and less because there's not even a guarantee anymore that you get that money back on the basis of your membership if we take the LO's squirrely model and try and say, we'll keep their membership and then withdraw all the benefits of said membership and create a massive precedent that scares off other countries when they are at their most economically volatile with the enormous amount of climate change, pandemic, geopolitical, refugee crises all over the world, meaning it makes even less sense to be investing in NATO unless you can rely on those money and resources to come back on the basis of having trade them over and on the basis of membership. But the second thing that I would note about their speech is that they again tried to co-opt by saying, if Turkey's vulnerable, they'll magically come over in the status quo. I'll wait for the DLO to try and provide analysis of where this is actually happening in the status quo, something I think it'll be challenging for them to do, given the motion itself allows us to fiat that Turkey is pivoting towards Russia in certain ways, or the variety of beautiful structural reasons my partner gave you about why Turkey feels empowered to be reckless in terms of its engagements with ISIS, in terms of its non-democratic engagements with other countries, in terms of its antagonistic behavior with Russia as well. All of which means it's either pivoting to Russia, it's an increasingly volatile state, or both that isn't changing in the status quo, which is why it necessitates a change. If they want to access our benefits, they need to prove solvency analysis without using our case, or else we automatically win. What do I think this then shows? The first is that all of their benefits, or rather harms, on what happens if we lose Turkey are premised on actually losing Turkey. I would say that the additional mechanisms they gave that add on to our case, such as they need military assistance at this time, such as they want to pander to their populace, or such as they're having a deflationary crisis, make now a particularly good time to show teeth. Why is this true? Both the reasons that they gave, but then the four reasons that we gave, that threatening to withdraw membership and the military and economic and military support, which is involved in that membership, one is billions of dollars is associated with certain types of financial assets, which is both a direct financial harm, but then also an indirect harm, because when those assets are relocated from Turkey, it dampens and suppresses investor confidence, which means you then have cascading effects on their credit rating going lower, the bail market changing in terms of how they view Russia and what how they view Turkey and what the risk of Turkey is, meaning you have cascading indirect financial harms as well that is threatened by this NATO withdrawal. Secondarily, it's the optical harms. As the LO hopefully conceded for me, Erdogan is in a particularly tough place after a failed 2016 coup against him with increasing amounts of military crackdowns against the populace. He desperately wants to be seen as legitimate by the international community, and this type of withdrawal causes him to be perceived as even more legitimate, which affects other countries' willingness to put their optics on the line and allow Turkey, put other countries' willingness to engage in trade relations with them when they seem increasingly volatile, and other major institutions like NATO that countries look to for the signaling effect of how trustworthy Turkey is withdrawn, and then you have cascading effects of other countries not wanting to work with you. Thirdly, the ways in which we see domestic unrest. What Erdogan wants to do, as Elo conceded, is prove to Turkey that he is the legitimate ruler, which is impossible to do when you have a massive institution like NATO withdrawing that comes with public combinations, op-eds in the New York Times, explanations from the NATO Secretary General about why they've made this decision, all of which flows freely into Turkey because they don't live in China, and even in China you can use VPNs to get access to a variety of free and fair media, meaning that Turkey's populace are well aware of what's happening, and this will again trigger thousands of protests in the street, which is exactly what Erdogan doesn't want. One, because that makes the pandemic worse, which makes him look worse. Two, because he doesn't have the capacity to deal with them after years and years of protests. Three, because he's already pushed to the edge, which is why he's acting so volatile to begin with, which this is then the tipping point to then be able to perhaps see a populist takeover of Erdogan, or at least more and more domestic pressure that we can then instrumentalize as the international community to put more and more pressure on Erdogan. But then the second thing that I would say is that then they collapse further on this case panel when they say, we think that after Erdogan is toppled, whenever that is, Turkey will come back later. Cool. I mean, they have to prove that, right? Or rather, they have to prove how it is that will incentivize them to do so. And I think that we've given you the case, the push that incentivizes to do so. But if we give them this magical best case, then long-term Turkey will come either way. The question in this debate is then, what do we do in the short term? And it's again non-responsive to Matea's analysis about how we are in a crisis of NATO legitimacy, whereby if we engage in the LO's model, it looks really uncertain whether or not membership gives you the benefits that NATO accrues. But you also see countries who are looking to NATO as the non-respondent right now and massive refugee crises that have been happening in terms of the climate crisis along the southern border with Greece. But you also now see the double optics on NATO of non-responding in terms of the crisis in Belarus right now. So we need NATO more than ever to step in and provide for the fact that the EU does not have a standing army. Step in for the fact that the EU demands a no violent pushback refugee clause without providing troop support on the basis that NATO would be able to step in. But if other countries are seeing that NATO is unreliable, will withdraw support on the basis of, not on the basis of membership, but rather on the basis of their own individual political interests, makes NATO seem more risky, more volatile, and when they're crisis as they are, want to withdraw their funds even less, making NATO even less capable of responding to any of the crises that we see happening in the status quo. And then the second thing that they said was more collapsing on their case. They say, you know what, even if we lose Turkey, Russia is, and the LO gave me 3 beautiful Wangs that I want to see the LO get their way out of. One has Parkinson's, and so he's particularly uninterested in expansive military aggression right now. 2 is focused on the domestic elections coming up, which is actually a mech I was going run, so thank you, LO. And 3 is overstretched with Belarus and other crises that they're dealing with, which means their own worst case was outweighed to be minimal by the LO in terms of Turkey turning to a Russia that does not want to militaristically expand, as per the analysis that LO gave us. But then the third and final thing is that even if Turkey is turning a little bit towards Russia, us giving them a magical best case that their LO seem to want to outweigh for us, for them, what does it mean that they're, what are the harms that we accrue? We told you, one, they're working with ISIS. Their only response is like, no, you would never want to work with ISIS because they're next to you. That's the exact reason why you would, because when you feel empowered by being a part of an organization that provides you support but doesn't hold you accountable, you then make security decisions that affect your own interests. And by paying off ISIS, by guaranteeing certain types of arms support, you can ensure that they're not going to attack you, especially when Erdogan knows that his domestic situation is quite volatile. A massive terrorist attack in Ankara would unsettle the population and tip them over the point to believe that he cannot protect them from ISIS, which is why he pays off ISIS in order to be able to ensure their support and maximize domestic stability in order to preserve his own stability. But then the second thing that they said is, this pushes them further and further into Russia, which Matea already outweighed as unique, which Matea already outweighed as insignificant when they can't scale exactly what certain amounts of increased arms look like or not look like in comparison to the wide variety of harms that they never responded to, ranging from Turkey being an increasingly antagonistic actor with the EU itself, attacking Greece shores, attacking and being non-cooperational in terms of like water disputes, gas and oil disputes within the area, literally annexing a portion of Greece, which makes it particularly hard and illegitimate for NATO to then be perceived as ability to step in on other crises like Crimea when they don't even step in other places. Democratic overreach, the ways in which they are literally leaking weapons to Russia, which the LO helpfully conceded as saying that we want to continue to share weapon support with them as long as possible, or the ways in which they've literally seemed to be an effective buffer where we're paying them billions of dollars to keep refugees out when Russia's now figured out a way to fly literally right over them. So all of the wasted money or all of the active harms that they are continuing to accrue in the status quo because they don't have solvency about how they actually change this are avoided on our side, even if they pivot towards Russia, although they already wait for us. Why that pivot towards Russia doesn't matter, and is premised on them not coming back to the negotiations table afterwards, which they already, one, helped prove for us, and 2, didn't respond to the additional mechanisms we gave about why Turkey's likely to come back to the negotiating table.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for that fine speech. Should now like to invite the second negative speaker to continue and extend the case side negative. Here.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
All good. Whenever you're ready.
Thanks. One moment. Alright. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think this is a debate of scenarios. What I will do is just clearly explain all the things that could possibly happen in this debate and why neg wins each scenario. The first is, Affirmative says you need to punish Turkey in order to get them to listen. We say they were naturally going to listen without you having to do anything. In fact, what we're explaining is there's an increasing trend of engagement insofar as Turkey's current desperation makes them need more loans from the West, makes them need more aid from the West, and therefore they are more likely to listen insofar as they can be promised more things in the future, not just by taking things away now. I think what second affirmative does is misrepresent this quite significantly and says David trembles for some reason. We are not saying we need to punish Turkey. We are saying that the current situation in Turkey is enough to make them desperate such that they're likely to listen to the West and need their aid. So I want to be able to weigh now. Does Erdogan listen when you are going to punish Turkey? Or does Erdogan listen when you can have future potential constructive engagement with Turkey? Because I think second affirmative assumes the former, but never resolves this deadlock because they don't really fairly respond to David as a consequence. The reason that the second is more likely is that Erdogan's nature as a politician is that he is a strong man authoritarian, which means that if Erdogan is punished by trying to beg to be back into NATO, by hoping that the West will take him back, that makes him look incredibly weak. It tells the populace that this is someone who can be pushed around and therefore is not one that they should be voting for in the next election, especially the hardcore nationalists that Erdogan is most likely catering to within this next election. What I'd like to affirm is that this constructive engagement, where Erdogan is currently trying to take on more loans from the West, where Erdogan is trying to ensure that there will be more Western involvement, is precisely the one we're going to win. It's because Erdogan is like, this is something Erdogan can frame as a victory for himself. That he's the one who got the deal back with America. That he's the one who was able to ensure that they were able to get through the crisis. And therefore, punishment removes him from that direction. Whereas we think he would have probably listened and come to the negotiating table regardless on our side of the house. What they do is they force him to double down on Russia instead, because otherwise he looks weak. He does not want to seem like he can be bullied by the West and America. Secondly, they say that there's no difference, right? They say there's no difference between Erdogan being friendly with Russia on our side and Erdogan being incredibly friendly with Russia on their side. I want to note that there is a significant difference here, and they can't just call this not mutually exclusive. I will outline these differences now. The first thing I want to note is that if it is this case where Russia is somewhat friendly with the West, somewhat friendly with, Turkey is friendly with the West, friendly with Russia at the same time, why is that actually a good thing for our side of the house? The first thing I want to note here is that the nature of Russian relations with Turkey is that it's soft power and not militaristic. And I think that's where Second F fails to respond to David. The reason Russia doesn't want to expand into Turkey militarily is not just because they don't want to, but because they're afraid of the. So what NATO promises is that if you invade any one state, all the other states have to respond and protect that one state. So Russia is probably unwilling to invade a state that has the promise of NATO backing, but is more willing to militarily engage insofar as it doesn't have that NATO backing, which is precisely why, at best, Russia is able to border Ukraine and the soldiers there, but is unable to meaningfully start an invasion immediately. Whereas I think that is far more likely to occur, and I think this is bad for Turkey and bad for many other countries in the region. And note that Turkey is not just Erdogan. So I think any negative consequence to Turkey is one that will harm innocent Turkish citizens that are already suffering from an economic crisis. The second thing I want to note here is that if Turkey, somewhat friendly with the West, somewhat friendly with Russia, I actually think that's really crucial because there are many instances where the West and Russia are engaged in a proxy conflict and there is no means of mediation from either side of the house in order to ensure there is a possibility for peace. That's what happened in Syria for so long. Whereas when around 2018 to early 2019, there was a significant improvement in the access of Syrians with social welfare and social services when there was a mediation between Turkey, Russia, and the US in order to ensure there would be more stability in the region. And I'd like to note, Turkey, because they are at a very crucial place, they're a very east meets west country, a lot of the important geopolitical conflicts within this area are against their interest. And here's where I want to rebut their claim that they're paying off ISIS. They're not afraid that ISIS will directly attack Turkey. They're also afraid that ISIS will continue to become more powerful in Iraq and Syria, precisely because if there is more conflict in this region, there will be more refugees going into Turkey, which makes Erdogan's job even harder, which makes him have to take on a significantly higher burden, which might cost the already dwindling resources within the country. Which is why even if you assume Turkey to be super selfish, they have an active interest in ensuring stability in the region, which is why they've largely tried to normalize northeastern Syria after US troops had pulled out the border. What all of this proves is that in key periods of conflict, it is incredibly important to keep Turkey in that regard. But next is that there are so many things independent of Russia that even if Turkey and Russia were becoming more friendly to an extent, it is unclear why we should still give up Turkey, because NATO is not just an anti-Russia organization. It is an organization that attempts to ensure mutual defense in order to protect peace globally. As a consequence, because again, of Turkey's position as one where it is importantly near a lot of geopolitical conflicts. They can't just say there are other countries in the area when they also explain that there's so many, there are no other Asian states in order to imply that there is a strong leverage that Turkey has with Russia and the US to ensure that this is not going to be a benefit that they can get with any other country. Uniquely, the places with the most refugees and immigrants in the world is Turkey. And as a consequence, there are many things that they would be able to do. And here's what I want to note. Even if Turkey is not the best friend or ally, they are a far worse enemy for all the reasons that they say. I think today they are bound by a NATO agreement that they do not want to get out of. But in like their world, in so far as you force it already, it is much easier for them to go rogue, much easier for them to go against the wills of the West. What does that look like? It is a lie for them to say that Turkey has not responded to the Belarusian immigrant crisis. What Turkey is doing is they're making it as hard as possible for Belarus to continue to send migrants to those flights. And precisely because a lot of Turkish airlines were used initially, Erdogan has actively ensured that this is not the case anymore. And there are so many other key points of interest in the region that Turkey not only is doing active things in, but could eventually do more and more evil actions insofar as they feel the West is the enemy. Erdogan has to justify to the population why he was kicked out and why the West is so evil. It's more likely he engages in these incredibly antagonistic things. And note that their only antagonistic actions that they named so far against Greece and Cyprus are largely economic. We think this could escalate into potentially military engagement that we think is far worse. Lastly, what does this tell Russia? This tells Russia that if you make good enough relations with any NATO state, NATO will kick them out. That's precisely what Russia wants, because they want to pick NATO apart. They want to ensure that this organization that is built against them gets weaker and weaker over time. And therefore, if they see that this works with Turkey, they can start to do this in many other states. They might do this in Eastern Europe, where there are many Soviet states still. Any other country that might want to join NATO, they might start to build relations with as a consequence. So it is either on their will, they continue to use this mechanism, and therefore Russia has an active incentive to ensure that they pick apart different states that are going to work against NATO, and therefore further weaken this kind of agreement. And therefore, it is not just about Turkey, but the overall stability of NATO that is important to be able to protect. I don't think they are able to do that, insofar as it's an active incentive for Russia to make relations with countries because they know NATO will kick them out in the future. For all these reasons, any possible scenario, one that is likely to Turkey listens to us, one that Turkey still stays friendly with Russia, one where there's so many other concerns, and one where there's so many other countries that ought to be protected, we win this debate. I'm very proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the second negative speaker for that fine speech. Should now like to invite a third affirmative speaker to conclude the substantive speeches on side. Affirmative. Yes, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
All good whenever you're ready.
Okay, just a second. All right, let me set my timer. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. I know it's a difficult debate, but I will try hard to clarify this debate, help you to know why affirmative side should win. There are several things I'm going to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why this, Turkey, it's losing its advantage, its value, its meaning towards the NATO nation. We should let them go. This is inevitable, and keeping them is creating net harm. And secondly, we're going to talk about the effectiveness of the alternative war, which they didn't really mechanize that enough. All the rebuttal will be integrated in my speeches. Firstly, why we think Turkey is alienating from NATO, and that's inevitable, irreversible. So that's why keeping them is not only costly waste of money, but creating more harms. There are several folds of of analysis here that concludes the whole debate. All right. Firstly, it's because losing its unique value towards NATO, as my first speaker and second speaker beautifully mechanized through 5 layers of analysis, why Turkey is no longer like geopolitically as well as like strategically valuable towards this. The only response coming from the opposition side is a framing response, right? They say, oh, if we can prove we can somehow control them, then we don't need to expel them. This doesn't really, it's dismissive against our analysis. And our analysis is important for several reasons. A, is because of an opportunity cost, right? You know that keeping Turkey as a member when it's already generating no value towards NATO is waste of money to the NATO. This money could have been spent, as my first speaker and second speaker already characterized you and mechanized to you, into, for example, building more NATO defenses in Macedonia and other strategically important nations surrounding Turkey, as well as in other positions. This money can be better used because those countries are smaller in size, as well as have more ally and peace and collaboration with the NATO. It's more reliable allies that we can strategically utilize this amount of money. But putting this money on their side of the house is a complete waste because you cannot generate any value. That's why it is important to engage that analysis. I don't think the third speaker will be able to do so. Secondly, we think this unique value, or like the Turkey losing unique value to NATO, is a preclusive argument to all the constructive engagements that they have already the opposing side have argued. Namely, Judge, if you want to credit their argument about constructive engagement is working, even if it is working, even if let's assume it's efficient, but because this engagement with, even if it's efficient to keep Turkey there, but it generates no net zero and net profit, no value, as proven by my partner, it means it's a bad deal that we should withdraw, right? You don't spend money for nothing, right? So even if that argument stands, we still think that you should evaluate our argument more, because value of the Turkey is the reason why we spend a huge amount of money in keeping them as a member of NATO nations. Secondly, why we think the volatility of the Turkey is inevitable. So that's why keeping them is generating more and more harms, and expel them out is actually good for the NATO nations. My two speakers has already give you a lot of analysis on why this is becoming more reliable, ranging from, for example, there's more collusion with extremist groups, and they become more Islamic leaning and less secular, things like antagonizing relationship between those things. There's having no responses from them at all. The only response is towards our ISIS point, where they argue that, Turkey is not going to support ISIS because, it's like ISIS will fight against them. We think this is not true. It's neglect of the reality. Turkey is supporting ISIS because they want ISIS to beat and battle with the Kurds people that they deem as a very that they deem as a terrorist group within their territory. So that's why they have a secret collusion with ISIS and selling them weapons, and they want to other terrorists to actually antagonize Kurds group to make sure that to ensure its agenda in this as well. That has already done so by invading into Syria to actually battle against Kurds. So that's why they have every reason to actually colluding and also get involved, get into the conflict, and the very massive conflict within the Middle East, because they want to clean out all the Kurds people in their hands. And this generated huge harm, and allowing with other 6 levels of harm that my partner has already laid out to you, which they totally neglect. It looks like, for example, it violates our principal obligation to actually keeping its member states to uphold the interest of the NATO, or it creates moral hazard, it increase the risk. And my Josh also told you there's a withdrawal of donors where they have zero response to this at all. And more importantly, we think in a comparative, right? If we expel them, or if we don't expel them, on the comparison more leaning towards Russia, that's another contention that they didn't address, that we think is also inevitable. Why is that the case? Because oftentimes, for example, the only reason they argue, we can't control them because Turkey have financial crisis that they need to address. So that's why they want us to help them. No, we think Turkey has already get frustrated with the conditionality of the money coming from NATO, as well as scrutiny and check and balance coming from NATO nations of how you can use that money. You can't use money for sale or whatsoever. So in the status quo, it is increasingly having more collaboration financially with Russia, because money coming from Russia or money coming from China potentially is a lack of transparency, is a lack of check and balances that Erdogan can easily use to to solve this crisis. So the mechanism that gave doesn't really mechanize why the constructive engagement is actually going to work. We think it is not going to work. And secondly, to argue, there's a nationalist, like if we expel them, then they're more likely to use this nationalist populism approach to actually frame NATO as a big enemy or whatsoever. They already did so by cracking down oppositional party and having scandals of not responding to the human rights, like investigations towards that. That's against the NATO. That's a directly middle finger towards NATO, saying, I don't care about your obligations or whatsoever. And so that's why we think currently they're already alienating, they're already leaning towards Russia, that it is not good. What is the important delta and comparison here? It's because of the cost benefits, right? Keeping Turkey as a NATO nation is very costly. You spend millions of time, and Turkey knows that. They know that if they remain a member, they don't have to do perfect job in controlling the refugee crisis, the migrant crisis. They can claim the money from the EU, from the NATO, because they know that they need Turkey as a buffer zone, etc., etc. And they have no way out to actually check the result of how well like Turkey is doing. So that's why it's very costly, and at best case, it generates low results, etc., etc. So that's why we don't think that consumes a lot of money and it's not efficient, because if you look at our analysis, we can prove you a lot of analysis of why the likelihood of a volatility in the future is going to be more and more. So that means NATO at the same time using money, not generating things, but also need to use money to solve all the conflicts that Turkey has arbitrarily manufacturing to claim for benefits for money or whatsoever. This is a huge waste of money which can better be used on our side of the house if we engage Turkey. And secondly, on the control, we don't think it actually can have control, because a lot of times this type of volatility is the reason why Turkey can actually monetize and cash in. So that's why they have every incentive to keep on creating conflicts and ask for money coming from the EU. We think it's better for us to abandon them and find a new, more reliable partner. Based on all of this, really proud to propose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the third affirmative speaker for that fine speech. And I'd like to invite the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive speeches inside NEG. Here.
Hi, I'm going to assume I'm audible and the volume's okay.
All clear. Whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Start in 3, 2, 1. The strategy from AF has been to blur the lines and operate on convenience, so I want to be clear from the onset. AF, till this point, has failed to demonstrate any pressing threat inherent to Turkish membership that cannot already be contained, given it has strong incentives to constructively engage with NATO, but further has crucially failed to demonstrate why these threats go away after expulsion. Because they can't win just on claims about Turkey's volatility or its strategic irrelevance to NATO, because the comparative they have to contend with is a world where Turkey is not just a passive or neutral actor to NATO, but one that is actively aggressive and one that is an enemy to its causes. I want to break this debate down on two issues. First, on the costs of expelling Turkey, and second, on our ability to pacify Russian aggression and what incentives this creates for the Kremlin. Let's first talk about the costs to expelling Turkey. I think there are two things to look at here. The first question we have to ask is whether or not Turkey is strategically valuable to NATO. Their claim is that Turkey has lost its role as a buffer state because other countries like Macedonia can fill that role now. We don't need to contain the USSR. This is untrue. We explained that Turkey plays a stabilizing role in a host of other NATO conflicts that aren't related to Russia, like its ability to stem the Belarusian refugee crisis, like how it controls the flow of refugees into Europe, like how it's been massively relevant to our ability to respond to the war in Syria, like its growing geopolitical relevance as it becomes the center of BRI expansion as the gateway to Western markets, etc. And no other NATO state is large enough to substitute this role. They assert that Macedonia has joined NATO. Good job, you don't demonstrate that it has the same same strategic relevance. But furthermore, it's specifically Turkey's role as a mediator between NATO and Russia that gives it strategic value, as we elaborate on from Mikko, to no response coming from them. But even if you believe all of this was a wash, the problem is that the comparative isn't just one where Turkey is not a friend, but where Turkey is an active enemy. At minimum, this increases the costs to you as NATO, since you have to spend far more defending not just against Turkey, but stationing troops at the states bordered around Turkey in order to prevent it from doing terrible things or atrocities along the border, which it's more likely to do now, where it views NATO as an actor that is actively aggressive and actively against its causes. It could engage in more rogue and violent actions. It can completely abandon engagements where they are really needed, putting NATO in a desperate position. You don't get a spot to mediate between the US and Russia and thus encourage further conflict. All of that means the failure to deal with this comparative largely washes AF's case out of the debate. And importantly, they concede that Turkey has strategic value themselves when large chunks of their case that they drop at third are spent on explaining why Turkey will come back to the negotiating table. Both sides give you reasons why Turkey is currently dependent on NATO. I know there's a lot of back and forth between speakers, but all of that suggests that it is already in a position where it's willing to make concessions and will make those concessions if you offer it constructive engagement as an incentive. E.g., if you allow it to take on more loans from NATO states in order to help with its currency crisis, if you play a stabilizing role in its domestic politics, it's more and more likely that it's unable to be volatile and more likely to cooperate with you. The one response we get to this is to call it an unprincipled squirrel without any logical analysis. I think this is just unfair name calling. Be charitable with the case we made. I think it's quite fair and quite logical. So they don't demonstrate why expulsion does anything to improve Turkey's relationships with the Union. We explain that Turkey is strategically valuable and expulsion makes it a strategic loss to NATO. We're already winning this issue firstly. But the second part of this issue I want to break down is how Turkey impacts NATO's credibility and the stability of the Union as a whole. The first thing I want to take out is this ludicrous claim that Turkey's presence makes NATO seem incredible, like people are no longer going to give investments from NATO. Just think about this from a sec. Who is currently investing in countries like Turkey? Hint, it's other NATO states. They aren't going to stop investing in themselves because they view their own union as unstable because NATO exists. But further, I'm really unclear as to why NATO is seen primarily as an economic union. I think the characterization we give you that it's a military mutual defense agreement is far more likely, which means people aren't going to stop investing in the EU because Turkey is a member state of NATO. If anything, here's the flip from me. NATO's legitimacy plunges if it loses its ability to control the conflicts it's currently involved in. E.g., if it loses yet another foothold in the Middle East, if it fails to rebuild Syria because it loses ground in Central Asia, if it allows for further and uncontrolled Russian and BRI expansion in Turkey because it no longer has troops stationed in those areas, all of its credibility plunges and all of the harms to NATO's investment, if you believe that this is its primary role, falls on their side anyways. The final thing they say under this is, well, Turkey is aggressive to other NATO states and that's bad. They say the reason this happens is because Turkey feels emboldened as a part of NATO. The problem with this is they never explain why any of that changes in the comparative when they're expelled. We think, if anything, when they're expelled and they're more desperate for other ways to make up the economic losses they're currently facing, they become more reliant on Russia. They become more willing to take desperate action against NATO states that they are no longer in the same union with and no longer have diplomatic channels to negotiate with. They're more willing to annex other states' territories when that is the fastest way for them, and there's no other way for them to extract concessions. On the comparative, when they are in NATO, you have both the ability to stop this by creating other incentives for constructive engagement or other avenues for constructive engagement, but furthermore, knowledge of what Turkey is going to do. You have intelligence sharing agreements. You know where their military is stationed. You know where you have troops in their border, and you know if they're going to prepare to attack you, for instance. So if the problem is volatility, I think they're far more likely to prop up bad actors like ISIS in their world when they no longer have the alternatives they can access from NATO. So at the end of that first issue, it's quite clear. Turkey is strategically relevant and becomes a terrible enemy to NATO in the event of expulsion. Let's secondly talk then about our ability to pacify Russian aggression. And I think the responses to our claim here has been clear. We say that Turkey has more say over its deals with Russia when it has the leverage of NATO backing, which is why Russia hasn't been able to station troops inside Turkey's territory, which is why it's been to the extent of arms deals and not annexation as we've seen in Crimea. So there's a nuance here. It's not just that engagement with Russia is de facto bad. We give you many reasons for why warming relations with with Russia is a good thing. It's about the methods Russia has the most incentive to use in order to get its engagement goals met. What were our claims under this? The first thing that goes unresponded to from them is our explanation from Mikko that Russia gains a new mechanism to tear NATO apart once you've expelled Turkey. It sends a quite clear message that if Russia is able to strengthen ties with the individual members of regimes, offer it a few arms deals, then NATO will be paranoid and overreact to those situations and expel them in the same way Turkey does. To no response from them, which suggests that in the long term, when Russia does recover from its domestic crises, it's far more able to tear you apart. The second claim that goes unresponded to, that comes all the way from David, is our suggestion that Russian influence over Turkey increases and manifests in worse ways. There's no more bargaining power to keep Russian troops off Turkish soil. There's no more bargaining power to assure some level of democratic norms and to disincentivize Russia from interfering in the democratic process in that country. What that means is if you believe that Turkish volatility stems from Russian manipulation, you give Russia more ability to manipulate Turkey and more incentive to manipulate Turkey in ways that mean it's likely to directly attack NATO rather than just the many random things they say Turkey is doing in the counterfactual. All of this de facto already wins us the debate. So begin.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the third negative speaker for their fine speech. I'd now like to invite the negative reply speaker to briefly summarize and compare the case beside Nick. Here.
Hello, can I be heard?
Whenever you're ready.
One moment.
Actually, Mikko, your voice is slightly faint. I don't know if it's just because
I'm
you're
not
not
speaking
in your
sound.
speech.
Is that better or?
Loads, whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Oh, camera. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. If you believe everything from Affirmative, I am still unconvinced by the case because I honestly don't think their harms are very big. The first thing they say is there's an opportunity cost and it's very costly to keep up the partnership with Turkey. The first thing I want to note is they don't really explain where else this could have gone, and I don't know how big this harm is because at best it's some vague building stuff that comes out of third Affirmative, which is both too late and not very important. Secondly, if Turkey is such a bad partner as they name, it is unclear why they want to do this to force Turkey back into the negotiating table, because it's unclear as to whether or not that partnership, as they believe, would have had any value to begin with. What we explain is that if you believe Turkey is a good partner and therefore want to force them to the negotiating table, they're more likely to go back on our side of the house. And I want to note, we not only gave analysis to the incentives for this, we broke the deadlock with respect to does punishment work or does wanting to ensure better relations generally work. And we said punishment doesn't work because for a strongman authoritarian, you don't want to look like you can be bullied around, pushed around, and therefore get what other people want from you. That is not Erdogan's style. At best, they say at third half, well, that happens on both sides. Sure, but then you kill your own mechanism as to why they would have gone back to NATO. Thirdly, this flips the case, right? It's not just that if you stop becoming NATO partners with Turkey, it's that they'll just stop caring and you save a lot of money. It is that Turkey, who now has to justify why they lost this agreement, why they were kicked out, Erdogan is going to rile up hyper-nationalist sentiments again. They say not mutually exclusive, which I think is a trend for a lot of their responses without really assessing extent and nuance, which I think loses them the case. Because what we explain is that it's a lot easier to tap into this hyper-nationalistic sentiment in order to ensure more military engagement, more likely to go rogue, more likely to do all the things that they explain of maybe funding ISIS, insofar as, and I don't think that's true by the way, insofar as you are more likely to be isolationist as a country because you don't want to look weak, you don't want to look bad. For NATO, that is a bigger cost than just having previously promised some kind of military engagement if anyone wanted to interfere with Turkey. Not a very compelling harm, in fact, a much smaller harm than what we propose. Secondly is on investment. Again, it's unclear why they lose investment, insofar as most investment comes from NATO states themselves. But moreover, what we explain at third neg is that a lot of this investment is lost insofar as you are losing your own regional and global influence because you lose one of the most important and key pieces of the region. That's another thing I want to look at. Our harms are much bigger. What we explain is that one, you can potentially escalate conflict. A lot of their examples of water disputes, economic things, or trade embargoes are things NATO states themselves do and are at best economic. Even if there were friendly ties and relations with Russia, what we explain is that this is soft power, which is heavily preferable to any kind of annexation, heavily preferable to any kind of military engagement that would have otherwise existed. What we explain is that you are much more likely to do that when Russia does not fear NATO involvement because they know Turkey is vulnerable, they can control Turkey to such a great extent. Secondly, you lose such a large foothold. I am unhappy with their alternatives because what they say is that, well, here's another country in the area without really explaining how valuable like Macedonia is in being able to be a buffer zone, why it allows any kind of NATO presence in that area. Not only do we explain the nuance of Turkey as a like growing regional power, we also explain that it's one of the most important land bridges for like into Europe and one of the largest places to take on refugees and migrants. I'm fairly certain this is a unique benefit only Turkey is able to provide. But thirdly, they never respond to our claim that if you can kick out a NATO state just because it has relations with Russia, Russia would love this. That's how they threaten the overall stability of NATO, because they can pick apart every single nation by building relations and then expect some kind of NATO kick out in the future, and therefore threatens the overall stability of the agreement, not just Turkey. Moreover, we explained there are so many other things than Russia that you should be concerned with, right? The Belarusian immigration crisis, Syria, and many other places in the region that were important, where if you are friends with both Russia and the West, you can serve as a mediator, which they significantly lose on their side of the house. You can believe them. I just don't think it's very important. I'm very proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the sorry about that, negative reply speaker for their comments, and now I'd like to invite the affirmative reply to briefly summarize and compare the case for side affirmative. Here.
Hi, you able to hear me okay?
All good. Whenever you're ready.
Panel, the reason why third neg and fourth neg complains that we didn't respond to quote unquote the nuance of their case is their case relies on things that were either one, totally absent in proofing, or two, reliance on totally fictional counterfactuals that preempted from the top of first F. One, things that were entirely absent. They say that this will become a template for Russia to reach out to other NATO states because NATO will be perceived to be paranoid from blocking off people on the basis of only a couple of military deals, which one ignores all of the decades of aggressivity that Turkey has shown, which is why NATO is not doing so on the basis of just a couple of weapons deals, which everybody knows. But two, they also didn't prove why it is that other NATO states are vulnerable to Russia. And actually, they conceded that Turkey is the most interesting example in this debate because it is a quote unquote a combination of East-West as per their second speaker, which means that that is the country that is most likely to be vulnerable to Russia. And all other countries have far longer legacy with NATO, far longer amount of trust and relationship with NATO, are far more dependent on NATO, and are far less willing to work with Russia on this regard. Completely absent analysis, don't credit it. Secondarily, it was based on fictional analysis when they said that Turkey is going to become more aggressive because in the status quo, it's a mediator and we can instrumentalize soft power to like learn about Russian military advancement. And otherwise, we're gonna have to spend a lot more money. When we preempted from the top of first F, 5 reasons why that's already happening in the status quo, which is why their case was so non-unique, which is why we didn't bother responding to it. The first is that they're working with extremist groups. The second is decades of past and current antagonism with other NATO countries, like Cyprus conflict, like Greek airspace, like Mediterranean water territory disputes, oil and gas disputes, or annexation of previous countries. 3, democratic overreach. 4, antagonistic behavior with multiple countries, both in and out of NATO, including Russia, which then risks more Russian backlash that NATO is obligated to step in with because they're a NATO partner. 5, because Russia is using this as a pathway to garner intelligence because they want to continue to share intelligence with Turkey after conceding that it works with them. Largely unresponded to. The primary thing they said is, you would never share weapons with ISIS because that's bad for you, whereas I told you that it actually prevents or allows you to coordinate with ISIS attacks to keep your own domestic stability. Then they said, oh, no. ISIS is actually bad because it's going to create more refugees. One totally told you Turkey's fine with that because they're creating refugees out of the ethnic minority group of the Kurds, which they disproportionately don't like and have ethnic tensions with. Or two, I would just intrinsically draw out that when Matea told you that we're paying Turkey to keep away refugees and we give them more money to keep away refugees, and then DLO says, oh no, you're never going to give money to ISIS because that would create more refugees. The combination of that analysis is there's actually a great perverse incentive to create more refugees because that then gives you leverage to make NATO pay you more and more, which is what Third Neg was so concerned about. Their final response is, Turkey is such a great geopolitical position when it comes to blocking refugees, all of which was preempted from the top of first half case, whereby one, there's innovation insofar as how Russia is creating migrant crises, like flying everyone over to Belarus. There's a little bit of mitigation about how they're trying to like change flight patterns, doesn't change the myriad of ways when Russia and Belarus can fly migrants over, and they're creating, that's the new template that we're concerned about. Secondarily, the fact that like the difference with Turkey and these other countries is we have the water boundary that allows us to do. Third, existing buffer states like Greece or Bulgaria. Fourth, new existing buffer states, none of which were weighed in terms of why these are insignificant versus them saying we simply didn't do so. I mean, like at an intrinsic value, we're outweighing them in terms of number, but also at an explicit value, we outweigh them in terms of willingness of cooperation and ability and stability to be able to effectively resist Russia. What did they then say? They try to co-opt our case by saying, we can just use financial pressures without using the threat of NATO. Whereas I told you that you can't just like withdraw parts of the NATO agreement if they're a member state, because one, this then makes everyone else afraid that you're going to do the same to them when NATO is already in a tenuous position, and we specifically need them to be intervening in places like Belarus. It is dangerous to risk other countries withdrawing, stuff they never responded to. But two, even if I give them their best case, we can do financial shit without the NATO NAM. I have further analysis on this that they didn't respond to, whereby one, it's not happening in the status quo. You can't defend a status quo where we presumably would have already been doing this if it's possible. And the info slide tells us that you're pivoting to Russia, which is further proof that it's not working. And secondarily, I told you that the NATO name is a signaling effect that causes massive amounts of other countries and private investors to look to whether or not this is a stable, volatile place, which is why the NATO name brand has far more cascading effects than simply the amount of financial support that we can do them, which would have been working. But then the third thing that they send is, like this would have already worked, which is why it's a perfect time to do it now. They then try and change that in the DLO by saying, oh, no, this wouldn't be a perfect time because Erdogan is an authoritarian regime, which one, that contradicts the LO who said that this is why Erdogan would want to concede. But then two, we gave you rational reasons why this would fit within his strongmanship incentives, which is again, reasons why it would be a perfect time to do it. And then three, they said it's super harmful because we're going to lose Turkey to Russia. The LO weighed why Russia's not important. The DLO tried to backtrack on this by saying soft power is important. I have no idea what that fucking means, honestly. But then third, the DLO then said, you know what, if Russia's not important, then we should keep Turkey, when we gave tons of other reasons why Turkey has exogenous harms, whether or not Russia's important, which is why it still flows back to us.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the affirmative reply speaker for their comments. Additionally, I'd like to thank everyone in the room for what I felt was, well, at least a rather entertaining debate. Start after. Wonderful. So I'm going to be keeping time for myself in terms of my OA. Feel free to do that as well for you folks. And I'll just go right ahead right now. Cool. Let me start by telling all the structure I'd like to follow. I'll start out just with the verdict. I give the debate to side negative. I think the motion falls. Straight up after the word, I'll just repeat that real quick. Negative, motion falls. Starting off with a few general comments, purpose of which is simply just clarity for the rest of my OA. And it essentially is a description of the perspective I've used basing off an average intelligent ordinary voter in terms of viewing out of the debate. Cool. I think I have four straightforward general comments here. One, the idea of the amount of money being spent and the cost that is being talked about here, especially the monetary cost, especially pushed as harm and talked about by side affirmative. This is going to be hedged across the hypothetical cost. So the money that's going to be saved is still going to be hedged across the hypothetical cost that would be used in terms of replacing all of the assets that would essentially be residing in Turkey. So the value for money that you're essentially getting by saving this cost and what would result as the benefiting opportunity cost is still going to be weighed against. This is something that wasn't explicit in the debate, but I feel like it's extremely important to be implicitly mentioned that this is what is used in terms of actually weighing it out as an impact. Second general comment, the usefulness of Turkey, an important part specifically in this debate all across, is underpinned by two elements. Control, which is the degree of control Turkey exercises in terms of the problems that they're causing or the specific areas that I mentioned. I'll talk more about it specifically in the clash. Control is the first element. The second element is will, or the desire of Turkey to actually act upon this. I'll specifically talk about where these two elements come into play when I'm talking about it in the clash, but it's important to understand that this dynamic involves these two factors, especially since both of them were considered in both framing and certain constructive argumentation. Both of it was challenged by either side. Third general comment. What does a comparative cleanly look like in the debate? Because I think it becomes important. On side affirmative, it's essentially that you chuck out Turkey, and the resulting fallout is that you go ahead and use essentially the stick of kicking Turkey out of NATO, and then the carrot in terms of all of the benefits that they would erstwhile have in NATO, and allied benefits in terms of aid, military support, perhaps in a restructured format. On side affirmative. On side negative is essentially status quo, where you keep them, and you potentially also, because of their specific nature of framing, push for a detente with Russia as a potentially ancillary benefit that would come across in the comparative. Last general comment is the idea of what is going to be the standard for me to go ahead and weigh impacts in this debate. I think this is once again somewhat implicit, simply because there are various priorities that have been take place and there isn't really one clean stakeholder. However, I think the standard with what both teams largely agree is the idea of peace and security in perhaps NATO membership and NATO countries, but it's largely talking about the Western Europe and Europe mainland particularly, rather than say countries like America. So I think this is largely the understanding I have in terms of peace and security in mainland Europe and things like NATO security in terms of the universal standard that I can use to actually go ahead and weigh arguments. All of that notwithstanding, in all of that fear, I feel like this is important to have this clarity from the get-go, because I'm just going to get straight ahead in terms of how I go ahead and weigh the clashes. Clashes, onto clashes then. Thematic clashes are basically just arranged and clubbed them together as large questions and elements within these questions that I need to reconcile. Cool. I think I have four, or rather three main clashes that I'm going to be talking about, and elements within those clashes is how I'll go about it. Clash one, the idea of security, and specifically security, like I mentioned, hedged across Europe. I think the comparative here is, when you talk about the major problem on side affirmative and the urgency that they have, is Turkey is deepening their relationship with Russia, and is also secondary complacent in terms of their position in NATO, at which point they're not doing quite as much as they can, and they are potentially also siding with Russia to a great extent. Versus what on side negative wants us to push is that you have to contend with an actively antagonistic Turkey after you kick them out. The reason as to how this I mentioned earlier on as well in the general comments is going to be two elements: control and will. I think inherently, and this is a slight strategic gaffe on side F that I noticed, that I can't seem to understand why Turkey wouldn't be useful, but exercise a great degree of control in those specific areas, in terms of if they are potentially a nuisance in certain areas, which is to say they're not doing enough to stem a refugee flow, they are potentially causing problems in other areas. I think it's inherently implicit that they have control. At which point I think there's a little bit of tension in this argument that Turkey is not quite so useful, because they do exercise a great degree of control, and that tension is already present in affirmative case. At which point I buy the idea that Turkey has control in the various elements that I'm going to talk about. So what remains is the idea of whether or not Turkey has the will to use that in a way that would, say, potentially benefit NATO and be productive for, say, European security. And this is where primary AF argumentation comes in terms of the idea of Turkey not being quite so reliable. The comparative then becomes, in the various situations that we spoke about, is potentially, say, ISIS, Belarus, Cyprus, or say violations of airspace and waterways. In all of these contentions, the idea therefore, and the comparative therefore, becomes a complacent Turkey that isn't doing quite so well but does have control, versus an antagonistic Turkey. And this is where the strategic gap I talk about, right? In terms of the ISIS idea, I understand where the analysis is coming from, is that they're secretly in cahoots with the ISIS, and it's potentially the refugee crisis is something that's going to benefit them. My problem is, in terms of degree and burden of proof that's required to prove that argument is rather high, versus potentially me understanding structural reforms and, say, systemic reasons as to why Turkey would not wish to ally with ISIS, and potential harms that Turkey has in fact suffered in terms of the refugee crisis and active costs that can be viewed, versus potentially the speculative, slightly conspiratorial need and understanding, at which point I think it's a little difficult for me to buy the arguments of ISIS. Similar with the idea of Belarus and Cyprus, right? Potentially when you have a complacent Turkey that is, say, regarding things like Belarus and Cyprus are essentially going to be belligerent to a certain extent, they're going to be hard-headed. It's still within the ambit of NATO, at which point there still is leverage, there still is moderating influence, and it's not Turkey doing their very best to screw that shit up, because it still needs to be hedged with Turkey's interests, specifically Turkey being quite so dependent that both teams agree on. versus the idea of when they're actively antagonistic, it's going to be much more problematic because they do in fact have control. But what changes is the degree of will that they possess to actively go ahead and cause problems in Belarus and Cyprus, because now it's not hedged across the leverage that they have in NATO anymore. It's hedged against their interest that they could potentially get from Belarus and Cyprus, and their support which they can now get elsewhere actively seek from places like Russia or China, which point they're likely to be significantly more antagonistic and cause more problems in Belarus and Cyprus. Also, similarly, I don't need to specifically go into the nuance. The underlying rationale remains the same for the idea of airspace and waterways. At which point, for all of this, the essential element that changes is how Turkey's will would be in terms of reacting to these situations, which is going to be altogether worse when they're antagonistic. At which point, I think fairly straightforward as to why security would be worse on side affirmative's world at the end of the debate. Which is why I give this clash to side negative. I think this is the most important part of the clash. I'm going to move on really quickly into slightly more simplistic clashes that follow from this. The second and important clash then becomes Erdogan and how Erdogan is going to be received in the world inside affirmative's world. I think once again, there are two elements to this, right? One, and because this is speculative, if Erdogan remains in power. Two, what happens if he gets chucked out? I think this idea is going to be underpinned with the analysis that side negative gives, that Erdogan getting moved away from power is a whole lot more likely in their world, which let's just say for a moment I do buy, simply because I understand the idea as to what is going to be the unique pressure in terms of the target demographic Erdogan is after, and his ability to cater to them and potentially win the next election is what's going to be compromised on side negative's world. I receive that specific nuanced analysis, which is why I'm happy to buy this conclusion that it's more likely that negative would see a world where they get chucked out. But either way, in these two scenarios, how does it play out? If Erdogan's in power on side, say, affirmative's world, when there's antagonized, he's much more likely to use that and fuel that narrative, which is essentially what negative's arguments was, to go ahead and generate that strength and therefore use that against, say, stirring individuals against Europe, potentially justifying a lot more or green lighting a lot more actions which are going to in fact be antagonistic. Versus when it's still within, say, under the thumb of NATO to a certain extent, this still means that Erdogan will have to play ball, will still have to cooperate, will still have to be at the negotiating table and have to moderate their influence in terms of the bad actions that are likely to take place. So this is still, of course, underpinned by the idea that negative still has a world where Erdogan is less likely to remain in power. But second, even if Erdogan is not in power and is potentially chucked out, the degree of how helpful the new government of the day of Turkey is going to be is still somewhat speculative, versus the idea that the new government of the day, which is likely to come in power on side negative's world, would have to be much more conciliatory towards NATO, because the NATO's pressing issues is essentially going to be their central mandate and the fundamental reason that Erdogan got chucked out of power, which is why they're more likely to play ball and be much more cooperative to NATO, which is essentially an exclusive benefit on their side. Moving on to the third and last clash, Russia and how Russia is going to be treated. I think this is a harm that essentially negative spins out, right? One, the idea that, and this is where the comparative looks like, it looks like increased distance and attempts to isolate and attempts to, say, potentially be, to try and gain either geopolitical or military strategical complex advantage over Russia on side affirmative's world, versus on side negative's world, you can push for a reasonable amount of deterrent because you have a deepening relationship between Turkey and Russia and that influence that Western Europe and potentially NATO has on Russia anyway. At which point I buy the idea that the deterrent is going to be much more helpful alongside, say, other systemic reasons why Russia is less likely to be antagonistic towards that deterrent and much more likely to be cooperative to it in terms of Russia's ability and Russia's interests right now and the capital that they do possess, versus the idea of distance and attempts to isolate Russia, which would likely spur them onto action. So ultimately, perhaps going to be worse for the targeted stakeholder. I think this is the end of the clash analysis and why these three specific clashes I gave to side negative. So what does the world look like at the end of the debate on both sides? On side affirmative's world, it potentially looks like, sure, the opportunity cost that you highlight in terms of pulling that money out means that you're not spending that money in Turkey. But that still means that you'd have to deal with the fallout of what happens after, which, once again, not explicitly talked about in that debate, but given the fact that it compromises security to a great extent, causes more problems, I hypothetically assume that it would potentially end up even causing a greater loss of money and greater loss of monetary resources to deal with that fallout. But even so, even if it weren't the case, it still means that that saved money and the potential opportunity cost is not going to be worth it for the cost of security, which would be the a priori factor, a priori commodity in this debate. Versus on side negatives world, you retain that leverage and reliance and you try and perhaps capitalize it to achieve the benefits that they seek to achieve, which for reasons that I mentioned in the clashes already, I find significantly more likely. I think that's me done for my OA. I'll have the opportunity for questions real quick. And if there are none, just mention none. Good. Side affirmative, any questions?
Yeah, we have some questions, but do we perhaps want to turn off the recording or?
I cool with it either way. I think I've run out of time for my OA, but